Let's get more from Andrew Lipow now on this drop in oil prices after the spike yesterday. Andrew is a longtime participant in the oil and gas industry, including quite a stint in petrochemicals. Andrew, it's great to see you. You, of course, head up Lipow Oil Associates. Can you give us your reason for why oil has dropped so sharply from yesterday's peak?
Well, Andrew, thank you very much for having me. Let me clarify some of the numbers first that are floating out there. There are 20 million barrels in total that are passing through the Strait every day. Roughly 14 million barrels a day of that is crude and condensate. The balance of it is refined products, LPG, and petrochemicals. Mm-hmm. That's why you're seeing a variety of numbers out there. The production losses are now amounting to close to 6.7 million barrels a day between Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the Emirates, and Iraq. Now, as far as the fall in the prices go, I think it started when President Trump indicated that the conflict may be coming to an end sooner rather than later. Mm-hmm. Of course, I will be looking at whether the Strait of Hormuz is actually opening or not to allow the transit of vessels through that waterway. At the same time, there are ways to divert oil away from the Strait to markets. We're seeing Saudi Arabia had announced the use of their east-west pipeline that delivers oil into the Red Sea. That has a capacity of about 7 million barrels a day.
Wow.
And in addition, the Emirates, through the Abu Dhabi pipeline, can also bypass the Strait of Hormuz. So I think the market is looking at ways to mitigate the supply disruption. Of course, it's not enough. Mm-hmm. And even if the various G7 governments release strategic petroleum reserves, there still is a substantial shortfall to overcome.
Thank you for clarifying that for me, Andy. So I think in normal times, and it's various types of products, the equivalent of about 20 million barrels a day goes through Hormuz, some of it condensate, as you note. But we haven't seen a shutdown of production of 20 million because some is going into storage and some getting out by other routes.
Well, that's exactly right. But what we have seen is, take Iraq, for example. They've already cut 60% of their production because they simply have the least amount of onshore storage compared to, say, Kuwait, the Emirates, or Saudi Arabia. But they're all involved in cutting production because they want to throttle it back so that they don't have to have a complete shut-in. And when we do talk about shut-ins and we've talked about production, we've also lost about 2 million barrels a day of refining capacity through either preemptively shutting down facilities, whether it's in Saudi Arabia or now in the United Emirates, or actually seeing damage to refineries, whether it's in Bahrain or Iran.
Yeah, damage, of course, that it's unknown how long that'll take to repair. So we could see curtailments for a while?
Well, that's exactly right, because even if the conflict were to end tomorrow, it'll certainly take a week or two to restore a lot of the production. Mm-hmm. But in the damaged refineries, since we don't know exactly the extent of that damage, it could be weeks or months or even longer. We simply don't know.
So just to clarify, the world produces something like 100 million barrels a day. Right now, we've lost production of about 6 million. But we hear about these 6 million barrels a day. But of course, there are, in theory, billions of barrels of oil in various stockpiles and inventories and strategic reserves around the world. So in the short term, it sounds like that could be covered.
Well, I think that's right. In the short term, not only are there onshore stocks, but there's offshore stocks in floating storage and tankers.
Right.
Well, much of that has been sanctioned oil, whether it's from Venezuela, Iran, or Russia. And what you saw over the last couple of days is Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent saying they're going to relax the sanctions on Russia so that they could sell oil to India. And they're looking at relaxing sanctions on other countries in order to mitigate this supply disruption by allowing more Russian oil to easily transact throughout the world.
So even if the fighting continues, U.S. and Israel go on attacking Iran, and Iran goes on striking out, or pretty well whoever it can, there is something of a float here of oil that can be released onto the market.
Yeah, there is a cushion there, and that's why we're seeing the G7 kind of decide whether they should or should not release stocks. But the fact of the matter is that when you start cutting production, as we have in the Middle East, where do you make that up from in the future?
Yes.
Now, the longer that this conflict goes on, the simple arithmetic is just to say that 20 million barrels a day of production and refined products is impacted. But how do you make that up in the future when you've literally shut in production and shut down refining capacity?
So you mentioned that Saudi pipeline. You said it can carry about 7 million barrels a day. I mean, that's enormous.
It is, but it already is being used to supply Saudi refineries on the Red Sea and also accommodate some amount of exports. So the amount that's actually available is not the 7, it's probably about 4. And we have yet to see whether the Yanbu port, where all of this material ends up, is actually able to handle that type of volume. So there's still a lot of questions. And once you get to Yanbu, you can go northbound through the Suez Canal to Europe or southbound to reach markets in India or Asia. But you've got to go past Yemen, where you've got the Houthi rebels who might be firing missiles at those tankers.
Oh, I'm sure they'd have something to say if given the opportunity. Yeah. Andrew, thank you very much indeed, because they're Iranian allies. Andrew Lipow, president of Lipow Oil Associates, thank you very much indeed.